It wasn't much of a surprise when my neighbors put their house up for sale a few months ago. Even in 2021, the self-righteous gossip of small-town America has a way of chewing up and spitting out anyone deemed different by the church crowd. And out here, the church crowd is just about everybody. As a chronically single lesbian, I've escaped most of that judgment from my neighbors by being essentially invisible to them, though I still cringe on the inside whenever one of the nosy Karens starts prying into my personal life and demands to know when I'm going to find myself a husband and start popping out kids. My neighbors, Amanda and Heather, didn't have the luxury of being invisible, and I honestly don't think the two of them ever had any intention of trying to hide their marriage in the first place. The whispers around town started as soon as word got out that two women in their 30s had moved into the old Victorian house next to mine on Elderberry Street. Heather was the granddaughter of my previous neighbor, Judith, and Judith left the house to Heather in her will when she passed away a couple years ago. So Amanda and Heather took the opportunity to live the quiet life together that they'd always dreamed of in the countryside, away from the hustle and bustle of the city, complete with a thriving garden and a house full of cats. I considered them friends, but we weren't particularly close in any of the time that they lived next door. I mostly just quietly adored from a distance how unabashed they were with their love, and admired how they confidently strolled through the neighborhood on their evening walks, holding hands and chatting and laughing, as though the company of each other was all they need to drown out the negativity of the more ignorant-minded folks in town. I'd like to hope that one day I'd also be so smitten with the woman of my dreams, and perhaps then the two of them would let me borrow a page from their book of not having a care in the world. Of course, it wasn't long after they moved in before the rumors began circulating that they were witches. Yes, apparently that's still a thing that some rural folks are happy to accuse women of being, especially women who don't care to hide anything about who they are, just to comfort those who are perpetually uncomfortable. It started as whispers among the school kids, and it eventually spiraled into groups of middle schoolers who congregated in front of the witch house, daring each other to knock on the door or disturb the peace in some other way. Unfortunately, around here, when the peace is disturbed and it involves anyone who breaks the mold of dusty old traditions, folks will always blame the disturbance on the people who they deem to be too different, regardless of who was really at fault. Things got really out of hand when the teenage son of one of the more outspoken church moms left a flaming bag of dog feces on Amanda and Heather's doorstep, and then inexplicably ended up with a case of hiccups that lasted for 4 days on end. From then on, the town acted like the devil himself had strolled naked down Main Street on Jesus' birthday. There were town meetings about the supposed witches that erupted in anger, protests of angry moms on the sidewalk outside of Heather and Amanda's house, and at one point a brick was thrown through their living room window late at night while the neighborhood slept. I suppose that's probably when Heather and Amanda decided they had seen enough, and after 2 years of living in that gorgeous Victorian home next to mine, they put their house on the market, and they disappeared. For the next few months, realtors and prospective buyers would come and go, and I got used to all the new faces and all the different cars sitting out on the street. Sometimes things would quiet down for a few days, and I wondered if someone had started the process of closing on the house, but then the weekend would come around and new couples would show up to take their tour of the home, and things would pick up again. I missed seeing Amanda and Heather stroll by every evening, their love shining through the neighborhood like a beacon, but I didn't blame them for leaving. What happened to them made me start thinking seriously about how much longer I could endure this town. Eventually, the cars and the families stopped coming altogether, and I was sure that I'd be meeting a set of new neighbors any day now. Probably neighbors who would be less offensive to the delicate sensibilities of the folks around here. But weeks went by, and I never saw a moving van or saw any cars parked in the driveway. I began to wonder if Heather and Amanda had given up on selling the house, but I had a hard time seeing how that could even be possible. The housing market isn't nearly as hot here as it is in some of the coastal cities, but a gorgeous historic house like the one next to mine would have been a dream come true for a lot of people looking to start over in a quiet town in the country. I couldn't imagine it would be that difficult to sell. Then, out of nowhere, just like that, one night I woke up to the sound of screaming, and I knew somebody had moved in. I didn't mean like distressed or terrified screaming. I mean angry screaming, arguing, fighting. Though I couldn't make out what the fight was about, I could clearly identify the sound of an adult male voice and an adult female voice coming from the old Victorian house next door. The fury in their voices was palpable, and my quiet little corner of my small town street was filled with reverberations of a mutual emotion between two people that I can only describe as intense hatred. There was a loud crash, and then there was quiet. The next morning, I took the dog out and inspected the neighboring house from my yard. There were no cars in the driveway. I never once saw a moving van come through to deliver the possessions of the new owners. Perhaps whoever lived there now gave up everything they had to afford the house. Either way, the for sale sign was now gone. Somebody was certainly living there. Throughout the summer, I never once saw my new neighbors, not even a glimpse. I had no idea what they looked like, but I knew they were surely there, airing their dirty laundry from inside the house for the whole neighborhood to hear. In the beginning, the fighting would wake me up once or twice a week, but by July the sound of their yelling became a nightly occurrence, always in the deepest hours of the night, when any reasonable person would be asleep, and always intense enough to make me genuinely concerned that somebody was going to end the night in the hospital. I thought about calling in a noise complaint, but it seemed wrong to begin a new neighborly relationship on such poor footing. And besides, the police around here tend to have a live and let live stance on things like that, unless the disturbance becomes genuinely life-threatening, or unless a church Karen is mildly annoyed about somebody's personal life. One weekend, I thought it might help to personally extend the sort of peace and kindness we generally expect around here as a kind of demonstration of the sort of neighborhood we try to be. I spent a whole Saturday baking 2 pies, one from my grandmother's special cherry pie recipe, and one apple, in case they didn't like cherry. I also baked a batch of my famous chocolate chip cookies in case they didn't like pie altogether. I put on my nicest casual dress and brought it all to their front door, hoping to introduce myself and bring a little brightness to their day, and maybe help them put a face to the neighbors who they were waking up every night with their fighting. I rang the doorbell, and nobody answered. I waited, and then I rang it again, and waited, before finally giving up, and leaving a note explaining that the pastries were a gift to welcome them to the neighborhood. I woke up again that night to the sound of their fighting. In the morning, the pastries were gone from their porch, but my neighbors were still nowhere to be seen. I was surprised and disheartened by how unreactive the community around me was to the events transpiring in the house next door. Where they were once outraged at the gay couple existing peacefully, there was now silence about the constant bitter screaming and crashing of broken dishes and furniture emanating from the old Victorian house every night. My older neighbor, Sally, across the street, who used to vent to me in scandalized, hushed tones about the audacity of Amanda and Heather to hold hands in public, now showed no signs of concern about the happenings in the house next to mine. There were no town meetings about the fighting, no protests on the street. Nobody cared. The loud anger and hatred of my mysterious new neighbors could never generate the outrage caused by the quiet and confident love that always shined bright when Amanda and Heather were around. Even when Sally died, nobody suspected the new neighbors, and people still tried to pin it on Heather and Amanda, who hadn't been seen in months. I read the police report following Sally's death, and there were no signs of forced entry that anyone could find, She had no known enemies, and nothing was missing from her home. But Sally's potted plants were all smashed against the walls of her house. Her cause of death was officially ruled homicide by blunt force trauma, and the report noted strange scratch marks up and down Sally's front door. As much as I disapproved of her views and how much it hurt to listen to her ignorance, I always thought she was a relatively sweet woman compared to some of the others around here, and I certainly didn't think she deserved what ultimately became of her. As word got around about the scratch marks, the people in town openly theorized that the witches must have returned for some sort of satanic revenge on the neighborhood. It was heartbreaking. What I found really odd about the whole thing was that for 3 nights after Sally died, I never heard a peep from my neighbors. No yelling, no crashing. The fighting ceased altogether. It still feels a bit sickening to say that those 3 days after she died were the best sleep I'd gotten in weeks, and I never once woke up to the sound of aggravated screaming from the house next door at 2 or 3 in the morning. But sometimes the truth is sickening, I guess. For those 3 nights, when I took the dog out to go to the bathroom before bed, a single light was on in one of the second-story bedrooms of the old Victorian house. It occurred to me that it was the first time I saw the lights on in that house since the neighbors moved in. Soon enough, though, the arguing started back up again, and my blissful nights of uninterrupted sleep were over. Aside from the nightly fighting, it became very quiet on Elderberry Street during the daylight hours. With poor Sally no longer with us, her nightly routine of watering her flower garden was replaced with sorrowful silence. And, of course, my new neighbors in Judith's old house didn't have a car and never came outside during the day, so it was all quiet on 2 separate fronts now. So it came as a truly pleasant surprise when I heard a car door slam one Saturday morning outside on the street, and I pulled back the kitchen curtains to see Heather and Amanda's car parked against the curb. Despite being exhausted from another night of trying to sleep through the neighbors yelling at each other, I was thrilled to see Heather standing on the sidewalk next to the car, texting on her phone. I put on my coat and went outside to greet her in the cool morning air. She was such a welcomed sight after the weeks of constant shouting from the couple who had moved into their old house. "Heather!" I exclaimed joyfully. "It's so nice to see you." We caught up for a bit, and she explained that she and Amanda had moved back into the city. Amanda had to work that morning, so she couldn't make the trip into the country, but Heather had made the trip just to run some errands and finalize their move away from town. "Oh, yeah, I'm just here making sure the plants are watered and the house still looks nice," she explained. She paused for a moment, glancing around. "Did something happen? What's with all the flowers outside of Sally's house?" It was the first time I'd really spoken to anyone about Sally's death, since folks around here don't really talk about things to process them, only to gossip and spread rumors. So I explained to Heather that Sally had passed away a couple weeks prior under somewhat suspicious circumstances, and it pained me to have to fill her in on the town's theory that she and Amanda were responsible for it. Heather shook her head and was clearly annoyed. "Of course they're blaming us. Honestly, Willow, I don't know how you can stand living here." She paused and glanced around again. "Hey, you didn't happen to see whatever happened to the for sale sign, did you? Obviously people here have it out for us, so I'm not surprised somebody stole it. But we'd really like to get this thing sold as quickly as possible." The question took me by surprise. I guess they hadn't sold the old Victorian house after all. Maybe they were renting it out, or letting some friends crash there while they tried to find a buyer. With the city almost 2 hours away, I guess it could be useful to have someone looking over things while the house was on the market. "No, I didn't see anything. I thought you two had sold it." I laughed, amused at my own misunderstanding. Then I straightened my face up, realizing that we were talking about potential vandalism, and it probably wouldn't be a source of amusement for Heather. "Sorry." "No, it's fine. I'll just get the realtor to come set up a new one." Then she pulled a piece of paper out of her purse, wrote her number down, and handed it to me. "Would you mind giving me a call if it disappears again? We were wondering why it was taking so long to sell. If people here are still calling for our heads on a pike, they could make this a real pain for us." "Sure thing," I agreed, folding the paper up into my coat pocket. "I'll let you know if I see anything." "Thanks," she smiled. "So, how are things here? Nobody's been giving you any of the trouble they gave us, have they? You know you're going to have some decisions to make when people figure you out, right?" I was taken aback a bit, but I composed myself, even if I may have stuttered a little. I honestly didn't know anyone knew," I said, quietly, resisting the urge to glance around nervously and make sure nobody could hear our conversation. Something about Heather and Amanda's certainty in who they were gave me the confidence to stand firm. "Oh, honey," Heather said. "We always knew. No new girlfriend or anything?" No, I insisted. "Pretty much the same as always around here. Just a little harder to sleep with all the arguing these days." "Arguing?" she laughed. "Who's arguing around here? Somebody breaking the weird, unspoken rule of pretending like everything's perfect? Sounds fake." I hesitated. I didn't really want to say it, in case the neighbors were close friends or family to either Amanda or Heather, but the arguing had been so intense for so many weeks, and there were constantly nights where I wondered if somebody was going to get hurt in the midst of the fighting. "Well," I started, It's actually whoever you've got living there right now. They're constantly at each other's throats, Heather, waking me up, screaming at each other all night. It's pretty intense. I've tried to introduce myself, but I never see them come outside, and they won't answer the door. Maybe you can try talking to them while you're here." Heather's face fell as I spoke, and I thought I offended her. "I'm sorry, I should really mind my own business. It's fine, really." "No, it's not that. You're fine," she said softly. She looked worried now. "It's just, Willow, we don't have anyone living there right now." My heart sank. Then who were these people living next door? Squatters? Criminals? Whoever was in that house, professing their loathing of one another each night like some sort of ritual, they were not supposed to be there. Heather spoke again. I really didn't think it would happen this quickly," she whispered. "You didn't think what would happen?" "Willow, when Sally died, were there any markings on her door?" "I didn't know about markings, but the police found scratches on the door. Why?" "Oh my God," Heather whispered. "Okay, Willow, listen to me. Amanda and I will be back to try to fix this, but there's nothing we can do until the new moon. That's almost a month away. You should be safe during the day, but keep your windows closed and your doors locked at night. If you hear any scratching on your door at night, call me immediately, and don't open your door. No matter who they say they are, don't open your door." My heart was racing now, and I'm sure the fear was painted all over my face because Heather immediately tried to comfort me. No, Willow, look at me." I peeled my eyes from the ground and looked back up to Heather's face. "You're going to be fine. I'm sorry I'm being intense. You're going to be fine. Just don't open the door, and you'll be fine. Okay?" "Okay," I lied. I didn't feel okay. Heather opened her car door and sat in the driver's seat. "I have to go, but I promise you're going to be okay. Amanda and I will be here for the new moon on October 6th, okay? And then everything will be back to normal." "October 6th. I repeated, numbly. Why wouldn't they just call the police and get the people to leave? Okay. Good. Heather started the car and turns back to me. And Willow, you might want to find a new place to live. We can't keep it away forever. Not anymore. She slammed the door shut and then rolled down her window. But, also because, well, you know why. And with that, she drove off, and I stood there, staring at an empty street, deeply confused and concerned about everything that had just happened. Now listen, I might not be the most outgoing or sociable human in the world, but I usually try my best to be a good person and help others when I can. After hearing Heather's warning, it struck me as immensely important to spread the message of caution to as many of the folks living around me as I could. There were people here who were not supposed to be here, and by the sound of things, they were more likely dangerous and quite possibly literally murderers. I quickly learned, however, that this effort to spread the word of caution would be futile and unwelcome. When I knocked on Jerry's door to the left of my house, he refused to come speak to me, insisting that he would have nothing to do with friends of those witches. When I approached Kathy and Jean working in their yard at the house on the corner, Kathy snarled at me and warned me, "We saw you talking to that witch. You stay out of our yard or I swear to God I'll have Jean put you down." When Kathy and Jean were both found dead a few days later, the community gathered in front of their house to pay their respects, and chased me away when I came to pay my own. But I did manage to get close enough to notice the scratch marks on the front door of their house. The light on the second floor of the old Victorian house was on for 3 nights after that. I quickly realized that my 9 years of peace and quiet in that small-town community were over. I couldn't leave my house without attracting indignant stares from my neighbors or somebody accusing me for being friendly with the witch. My trips to the grocery store were like a walk of shame. One of the church ladies poured a whole container of Greek yogurt over my head, and I had to abandon my groceries altogether and go home to wash off, crying uncontrollably in the shower. The teenagers gathered outside of my house, pointing and daring each other to come onto my property. One morning I woke up, and my house was covered in eggs. I once thought kindness was a valued asset in this little town, but I was beginning to realize that it was nowhere near as important as conformity. Kindness here was never meant to be extended to anyone who the town deemed to be too different, and everyone now knew that my neighbors saw me being kind and friendly with Heather. So when I woke up one night to my dog barking loudly at the bedroom door, I assumed the kids were outside raising hell again. I was obviously used to waking up late at night, but usually because of the yelling next door, and not because of my typically well-behaved dog getting worked up over a disturbance outside. I threw on my robe and made my way downstairs as my dog rushed to the front door and started barking furiously. I was just about to throw the door open and yell at the kids to go home when I heard a voice from the other side.
"Hello? Is anybody in there?"
Came the frantic voice of a woman. "Yeah, I'm in here. Who is it?"
"Oh, thank God."
she exclaimed.
"Please, can you let me in? My husband has lost his mind. I think he's going to kill me."
I instinctively reached for the deadbolt and thought twice before pulling my hand away.
Please let me in. Can I use your phone to call somebody? He's going to kill me."
She screamed through the door. It was a voice I vaguely recognized, but it was not any of the neighbors I used to be friendly with before the town decided to shun me. "Who is this?" I asked, trying not to sound too demanding of someone clearly in distress. But after hearing Heather's warning, I was hesitant to let anyone in without knowing who I was talking to.
"Please, ma'am, he's coming. He's going to kill me. Please."
And then I heard a frantic scratching outside the door. I backed away. "Who are you?" I asked again.
I'm your neighbor. I live in the Victorian house next door. Please open the door.
The scratching intensified against the wood of the outside of the door, and was occasionally interrupted by the sound of her pounding against it before scratching frantically again. The voice transitioned from desperate to furious.
Open the door. Let me in.
I retreated slowly until my back was against a wall, and I sunk down onto the floor. Heather's words rang in my head. Don't open your door, no matter who they say they are. Don't open your door. The lights in my entryway flickered and then gave out, and I was in darkness. The wind outside picked up and was howling through the trees in my yard. Then the scratching and the screaming stopped. I sat quietly for a moment, heart pounding and breathing so quickly I nearly hyperventilated. I quickly pulled my phone out of my pockets to dial Heather, and I dropped it on the floor next to me because my hand was shaking so much. I picked it up and saw that it didn't have any service. I cursed under my breath and rested my head back against the wall. Then, someone was pounding on the door again. This time the voice was male.
Let me in.
He shrieked at me.
I know you have her in there. Let me in.
The shrieking started again as my dog barked furiously through the gap under the door.
You give her back to me. I'll kill both of you.
It felt like his screaming must have filled the entire neighborhood, because it occurred to me that I didn't hear a peep on the nights that Sally, Kathy, and Jean all died. It seemed unlikely that anyone would come and help me now, but I remembered Heather assuring me that everything would be fine so long as I didn't open the door. I didn't feel fine, but her confidence and unceasing kindness was still comforting.
You better let me in. I'll drown you in your own blood.
Then the deadbolt clicked to the unlocked position. I sat, frozen and shaking, staring at the door.
You think you can hide from me? I'll get you both. I'll give you the choice to come out on your own, or I'm coming in to get you.
The scratching intensified, and he started counting out loud.
1. Don't you dare let me get to 3. 2.
And finally, I could move again. I lunged at the door and turned the deadbolt and held it there as strongly as I could. But it was no use. It turned back to the unlocked position against all the strength I could muster, and I couldn't lock it again.
3. That's it. You're dead.
But nothing came in through the door.
Let me in.
He continued shrieking at me. Heather was right. He couldn't come in unless I opened the door. I sank back against the far wall again and sobbed, both in fear and relief. The scratching at the door never ceased. He started pounding against the door so hard I thought his fist was going to come crashing through. The door began shaking violently, like he was pulling on the handle from the outside, trying to rip the whole thing from its hinges. That put my dog into a frenzy, and she started barking fiercely, the same deeply primal protective bark I'd only heard once before, when a drunk man grabbed my arm one night when we were out for a walk. She jumped against the door, barking at the man on the other side, and I realized she was jumping for the handle. With the deadbolt unlocked, she could open the door with the right timing and precision. Her determination to keep me safe was going to be the end of us both. I lunged at her and grabbed her by the collar. "No," I shouted. "No, no." The pounding on the other side of the door was just inches from my face.
Let me in.
He screamed at me. I dragged my dog away as she tried to jump out of my grasp and get back to the door to defend the house. I brought her upstairs into the bedroom with me and closed the door, and we both waited. We didn't leave the bedroom for the rest of that night, and whoever was outside the door never came into the house. From the upstairs, I could hear the pounding and the abusive shouting for hours as I sat in darkness, trying to focus on the sound of the wind howling outside the bedroom window. There were times when I was certain the door downstairs was going to break down, and that I would die at the hands of this deranged lunatic. But when the first signs of morning light began to show in the sky, the shouting and the pounding and the scratching all faded away to quiet. When the sun finally peeked out over the horizon, the power came back, and my bedroom light flickered on. Cautiously and quietly, I made my way downstairs. I could hear birds chirping outside, but it didn't relieve the unsettled feeling in my stomach. It wasn't until I heard someone on my street start their car for work that I found the courage to open the front door. There was nobody on my porch, but the outside of the door was mangled by deep and violent scratches. I went back inside and cried. When I called Heather to tell her what happened, she was mortified.
"I'm so sorry, Willow,"
she reassured me.
"We never expected this to happen so quickly. We should have been there."
She and Amanda drove up that morning to see the damage, and Amanda greeted me with the most genuine and caring hug I'd ever felt in my life. I cried into her shoulder while Heather examined the scratches on the door. The two of them explained to me that it wasn't safe to stay now, and offered me their second bedroom in the city for as long as I would need it, so long as I could stand being around their cats. I laughed through my tears and agreed. An apartment full of cats sounded lovely after what I just experienced, and I knew I would never feel safe in that house again either way. They helped me pack a couple bags and round up the dog, who was skittish around people now, after the trauma of the night before. I swear I saw Amanda whisper something into her ear, and she immediately became calm and followed us to the car. On the ride to the city, I finally learned the truth. Heather explains that within the Victorian house lived an entity that was the embodiment of the home's first occupants in the 1850s. The two of them had a deeply toxic and dysfunctional relationship, and though many in town suspected that it would end in violence, everyone thought it was too impolite to intervene. In 1858, in a fit of drunken rage, the husband murdered his wife and hung himself in the upstairs bedroom, the same bedroom where I saw the light on after the murders. After their deaths, the sheer force of their dysfunction and mutual hatred imprisoned them in the house forever, and that spiteful energy became the entity that has haunted the house ever since. For 163 years, the women in Heather's family kept watch over the house, keeping the entity at bay with a ritual they performed every month under the new moon. For the past 40 years, that responsibility fell to her grandmother, Judith, a great and powerful witch in a long line of witches. Over the course of her grandmother's life, the practice of witchcraft was largely lost in her family, as the talented women in the bloodline focused their energy on a multitude of prestigious careers in law, filmmaking, and other highly specialized fields. Only one of the grandkids practiced and perfected witchcraft, and just so happened to fall in love with and marry another witch from her coven. So Judith left the house to her love-struck granddaughter and her witch wife, to carry on the tradition of keeping the demon at bay and protecting the town. "Are you kidding me?" I interjected. "Everyone in town was right all along? You're both witches?" They laughed, and Amanda chimed in. "Sure, but you know very well, widow, that's not why they hated us." Heather sighed and rolled her eyes. "It's a funny thing. In 2021, they'll still hate you for being gay, but they'll never say that's why. They'll just say it's because you're a witch. Somehow that's less nutty than saying they hate you for who you love." As she spoke, she reached out and held Amanda's hand, and they shared an affectionate look between them before Heather turned her attention back to the road ahead. "Okay, but they still weren't wrong," I reminded them. "You are witches." "But they didn't know that," Amanda exclaimed. "And besides, we were protecting them. We never did anything to them. Heather laughed. Honey, you gave that boy the hiccups for like 4 days. Amanda huffed and crossed her arms. Yeah, but he deserved it. We all erupted in laughter, and my remaining fear over the night's events melted away into a sense of finally being among people who were safe. Not just for the first time since last night, but perhaps for the first time ever. When we arrived at their apartment, I was greeted by 5 different cats, who all leapt from their perches and rubbed themselves against my legs. I helped Heather and Amanda move some things out of their second bedroom, piles of spell books, bundles of herbs, vials of concoctions in multitudes of colors. There was a futon that we transformed into a bed, but they promised me they'd rent a moving truck and go fetch my bed and the rest of my things in coming weeks, and that I wouldn't have to join them if the trauma of the night before was too much to handle. They said I was welcome to stay with them as long as I wished, and I sensed that their promise was genuine. And that's where I've lived for the past 2 weeks. It has honestly felt more like home here than any other place I've ever lived. This morning, over our morning coffee, I got the urge to ask them what they planned to do with the old Victorian house. They explained that they were trying their best to make sure it was sold to a witch to keep the tradition alive of protecting the town. Now they really needed the money, so they were planning to just sell it to the next person who made an offer. But they never expected the entity to gain in strength so quickly while the house was still on the market, and now they suspected it would become much stronger if nobody was around to perform the ritual under the new moon. When is the new moon again? I asked. You didn't know that off the top of your head? Amanda teased. You've got a lot to learn, Willow. It's October 6th, Heather answered. I thought for a moment. That's tomorrow, I reminded them. Are you guys going to go perform the ritual? The 2 of them glanced at each other. Well, Heather started. We actually decided it's a bit much to make the trip out there every month. It's a 2-hour drive, Amanda reminded me. So, you're just going to let that thing get stronger? I asked. We're not letting anything happen, Amanda said. It's just happening. She took a bite of her toast and a sip of her coffee, then unfolded the morning paper and began reading the news. And besides, she continued, after how everyone in that town treated us, screw 'em.